One of the biggest challenges that people have when considering or getting into direct action or organizing is how do you field the opinions of other people that have done it in the past? And what kind of questions would you ask those people? Today's video in the Direct Action 101 series is going to be exactly just that. And in this Direct Action 101 series, we're breaking down the different methods of direct action, the tactics and histories behind them. And I wanted to sprinkle a few videos throughout this series where we talk to organizers and I let y'all ask some questions that have been on your mind about direct action and organizing. So this video is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be with revolutionary and video essayist Lucretia McEvil. Lucretia has been on my podcast, The Dugout, before. They're a really cool comrade that I think just explains things in such a clear and matter-of-fact way, and that's something that's really helpful and needed. And part two is going to be me talking to the co-host of my podcast, The Dugout, where I ask Jordan a few questions around how did they get radicalized? What are their perspectives on nonviolent versus violent direct action? Thank you for watching this series, and stay tuned for the end for another little message from me. One of the questions that was asked that I'm kind of interested in, someone at STSU dash high asked how to start organizing when you have social anxiety. This was a question that immediately I was like, I don't know how to respond to this. But then I started reading this zine a day or two ago that kind of gave me a lot of thoughts. But I thought it was an interesting question, kind of in terms of a lot of stuff that we were talking about before we started this. But I guess what would your response be to that question? How to start organizing when you have social anxiety?
To your point, we were kind of like touching base on this a little bit earlier, and my first initial thought is that sometimes we can overthink or like have expectations of like who we are supposed to be like before we even start. So I find that when people hear the word like organize or activist, they think of like Fred Hampton, they think of Huey P. Newton, they think of political prisoners, they think of putting your life on the line and getting doxxed and things like that, which are all possible, but you don't have to invest fully or like dive 100% into anything. You can start organizing by volunteering at your local community fridge or your local info shop like once a week or even once a month if you have less time. And that is organizing. So, I think the best way for you to approach it is just meet yourself where you are, like, currently when it comes to your capacity, your, monetary ability, your physical abilities, and start from there, and don't allow your own expectations or the expectations of others to persuade you in any particular direction. Because what I've noticed in my own personal life is when I focus on consistency, that's when I feel less anxious instead of thinking of like the amount of like, oh, I'm not doing enough. But like if I'm doing a little bit every day, then I feel better. Also because it's math, you know?
Yeah. What I've always kind of worked through anxiety wise in my organizing journey, I guess, is I always try to figure out the source of my anxiety because I feel anxious for different reasons. Like sometimes I'm going a gathering or a meeting and maybe it's a new space and I feel anxious because I have a lot of thoughts around meeting a lot of new people and having to expend a lot of social energy. Or is it going to be like a certain demographic that I don't vibe with? Or is it dangerous or whatever it may be? And if I can identify why I'm feeling what I'm feeling, sometimes I can like name it and remedy some of that. And so like for me, if I'm at like a really intense protest and I'm feeling anxious, usually I probably need to talk to someone that I'm there with, kind of let them know how I'm feeling and kind of try to create the space. So it's like if we need to leave based on whatever either of us are feeling, let's kind of set that precedent. If I'm going to like a gathering and I'm anxious about who I'm going to meet or whatever, I usually try to not force myself to over socialize, to try to like push through. Instead, I allow myself to kind of settle in what I'm feeling, either let it pass or I like acknowledge that it's trying to tell me something. Cause I do think when I think of like social anxiety, it's either like to me, like a chemical imbalance. Like I don't fucking know where it came from, or it's trying to tell me something. And I think, especially when you're organizing, it can be a really good tool or place to practice where it's like, where is this coming from? Because like
sometimes if you're at a action and you're feeling anxiety, that's you being aware that the state is watching and something's about to fucking go down. So maybe you should
Yep.
listen to it when it's in that kind of situation. But yeah, all of your points about like, especially like not having a very particular idea or expectation of yourself. Because for me, any new political space I show up to, I'm always going to enter it more, not even meek, but more quiet, so I can kind of orient myself. And sometimes my body reads that as anxiety too.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Just another quick anecdote, like to your point about like your anxiety being a tool of positivity at action, like that actually happened to me in 2020 for George Floyd. We were marching on I-95 and we shut down the highway, literally. And the cops were pushing us off the ramp, like off of I-95.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time with the people I was with, I just got really anxious because I peeped game. Like they're moving us to get off the highway because they want to do something physical to us. So at that point, me and my friends were marching for a while. So I told them I wanted to leave, and we ended up leaving. And unfortunately, that's when everyone got pepper sprayed. They like kettled everybody off and pepper sprayed them in a corner. But when you feel those things, like, listen to them. Like, you could be protecting yourself, you could be protecting others. It's okay for you to not stay the entire march or the entire action, and that's something I had to learn when I first started
Yeah.
organizing because I felt guilt if I left early for some reason, but it's all self-imposed. Like, you
Yeah.
went, you showed up, like, that's the point of action is to show your political support, not to stay the longest.
Yeah. That's such a funny quirk in like being an organizer and going to protest. Cause I definitely a few years ago, I passed that mark where I'm like, if I'm going home, especially if I'm
Yes,
like, I don't know who the fuck is planning this. Like, is it a counterinsurgent? Like, what the fuck? Like, sometimes you just got to be like, no, not for me.
right.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay for you to do that too, and, like, you're not any less of a comrade if your feet get tired and you wanna go
Yeah.
home, or,
Yeah.
like, if you feel unsafe, and you wanna go home, or if you have, like, a panic attack and wanna leave, like, all of
Yeah.
those things are valid, you know?
Yeah.
From Naomi, 6056. How to concisely and adequately persuade those who agree in principle but disagree on method. This question, when it was sent to me, that was like the first one that really stood out to me
Mm.
because we've been saying in conversation back and forth, like, this is like my constant thought lately. It's like, how do I organize with people who I don't necessarily get along with or agree with all the time? This author from England called Paul Mason, he wrote about how to defeat fascists, and a large part of the book and a large part of his argument is that there was an anti-fascist coalition, and the easiest way for us to organize a bunch of different ideologies is to focus on our shared goal.
Mm.
And I think that is the most important thing for us to focus on. It can't be just Trump, right? I think that's where the Democrats failed because it can't be just Trump because it's like Trumpism. It's not just Trump. It's like what he represents is the actual issue. So for us on the true left, it has to be anti-fascism, like full stop. So that way we can organize with communists, Marxists, progressives, even democratic socialists, because 'cause they're anti-fascist, you know what I mean? Instead of us being like, "Well, I wanna do it this way or that way," like, I think that's the easiest way for us to get, divided.
It almost makes me think of like, what principles do we agree on?
Mhm.
Because if we don't have principles that we agree upon in terms of how we react to or do or don't snitch to the state, that to me is different. You want democratic socialism and I want, I don't know, fucking democratic federal. I don't even know. Like, and so I
Right.
think one, it's important to figure out like what the principles are that we agree on, because sometimes we can agree on certain principles and then move from there when there are actually other principles that might be applicable to the ways that we're trying to be in solidarity with each other, to collaborate with each other, et cetera. Thing that I noted when I was thinking about this question is I think there's importance in building direct action based trust and non direct action based trust. If it's folks that you maybe aren't tactically aligned with, in terms of like maybe you're more into black bloc and they're more into petitioning and canvassing and trying to get certain kinds of city council members into office. Maybe you set boundaries around the kind of political activity you do with people based on their principles, and you don't expose them to methodologies that you do because maybe they're more aligned with the state. I feel like there's like an element of security culture that can be applied there. I was just doing humanitarian aid at the US Mexican border, and there were different groups there that were working together. And one group was way more centered around harm reduction, and another group was like way more religious. Another group was like hippies, but they all were able to help each other out based on their common goal of like opposing border policies and the way that people
Right.
are like put in harm's way. And the differences they did have, to your point, those didn't matter in the space of getting that work done because no one was trying to be an obstacle to anyone else's work. And so I do think there is a distinction of like, do you just disagree on method or tactics, or is this disagreement going to lead to someone trying to sell you out, or you just not being in
Right.
community with each other, or maybe wanting to work alongside each other but not wanting to talk about that shit. And so I think it's important to figure out where those lines are, because even on principle, it's like you can both be radicals or revolutionaries, but maybe one of your principles is like being a kind person in meeting spaces and making
Right.
people feel welcome. And for someone else, it's not. And I'm like, that those are certain principles, but they're also different methods, even in terms of how you hold space. And so I think it's definitely an because I'm also like, what I'm like, what principle, what methods? I don't know. Yeah,
Right.
it's a
No,
good question. It's a really good question.
for sure. What are our disagreements? If it's like bigotry, absolutely not. And that's like
Mhm.
something that I want to keep clear. Like what I was saying before, it was like all hell broke loose when I talked about collaborating with the
Yeah.
left or like aligning the left. And that was a lot of people's sentiment. They thought that that meant I meant collaborating with people that I had ideological differences with. And when it comes to something like that, that's not what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. Like I would never organize with a racist or a bigot because that is ideologically opposed to my belief in anarchism that everybody is a dignified human being,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
deserves love and respect and care. So I can't organize with a bigot just off principle because that's my ideology. So it's never them. It's like, yeah, I guess it
Yeah.
really comes down to what are we disagreeing on
Yeah.
and if
Yeah.
it's a danger to
Yeah.
anybody.
Yeah, because even the agree on principles, I'm like, some people might lie to you and say they agree on the
Yes,
principles, and
right,
then you figure out later
right,
on. Because yeah, and earlier this year when I was a part of like the U.S. encampment stuff, and how I was organizing with folks that were from different economic classes, different identities, and we assumed that we were in solidarity with each other, and we assumed that we agreed on principles. But when it came to methodology, the differences in our principles led to differences in our methods. So, like, their principles were like, we need radical revolutionary change, but it needs to be based in like the pursuit of optics, of aesthetics. And
right.
that led to them choosing tactics that were less militant, less antagonistic towards the state. And by the end of that experience, I realized like I don't even know if we agreed on principles when we started out. And so maybe another point of this is doing that temperature check of figuring out if you actually align principle wise, and like kind of checking in like throughout the process, because it's always going to change. People are going to reveal themselves to you differently, also based on the context. Because also when people get scared or the state resorts to repression, like sometimes people's principles change.
Yes. It's a different person that will come out for sure. Exactly.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. The trauma responses, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, like those are all very real responses people will have.
From at sun underscore seeker MKE, and they asked, what are the red canary slash markers and historical movements that have signaled that it's time to escalate or even switch tactics? What are ours now, if any? I thought it was interesting because one, it's kind of like, how are we measuring the historical moment that we're in? Are we agreed upon what the historical moment is? It immediately made me think of now, like, why is this a moment or a period of time where we should switch our tactics or escalate? The US historically repeats itself. We return to previous structural evils. Cyclical nature in itself means that we have a new opportunity to be antagonistic towards like a previous evil, but we also are simultaneously in a new predicament or time period now. And so we have to find new tactics and strategies. I also think about the fact that the state has its own sociopolitical memory. It has its own capacity to reach back into lessons from the past and like reorient itself. But I guess I'll pull it if we're thinking about tactics and political violence and what is necessary to kind of change our material conditions. I will reference creating a movement with teeth again. I think it was, or maybe I was reading Blood in My Eye by George Jackson, but he talked about how one of the ways that we can destabilize the fascism of the state is through the unpredictability of our tactics and our diversity of methods and the political violence that like regular citizens can kind of enact. We can't agree to the playing field that the state has established for us. And if
Right.
we're in a period of time or a moment in human history where we see that the conditions that the state are trying to create for us are changing, I think that also means we need to escalate or switch our tactics. And what that would mean is like Obama won and became president, and that was like its own like sort of forced cultural shift in the US in terms of like we're post-racial. And then Trump was this kind of white lash, and
Mhm. Mhm.
that was a change in conditions. And I think out of Trump's first presidency, like there were increased models of like anti-deportation work and mutual aid and community defense that people did deploy, and that was because the changing conditions that the state presented. And I think now, once again, we see a lot of those same conditions potentially coming back. The repression, the bigotry, the fascistic violence, that's also going to increase. And so if our antagonizer is changing their methodology, we also need to change our methodology too. And I think that means we need to understand who our antagonizer is, what tactics
Mhm.
they have at in their tool belt, and what we as communities need to be capable of. Because even yesterday, I sat in on a talk about anti-deportation work, and they talked about like how it's important for communities to look at the different ways that different federal agencies or different federal enforcers work, whether it's ICE or your sheriff's department or your police department. They all wear different things. They operate differently. They come in for different reasons. They're called in for different reasons. And if the new infrastructure of how immigration or deportation is it's if that's going to happen, it's going to involve a variety of operations and resources that are going to be a shift in process. And so
Mhm.
if the state is moving differently, we also have to move differently too. And ideally, I think in George Jackson's kind of perspective, we need to be unpredictable in the ways that
Mhm.
we change our tactics and escalate.
Sure, yeah, I definitely agree with that. I read a tweet recently, I forgot who it was, but I'll just paraphrase them. They were saying like they realized how like malicious America was like as an empire during George Bush, like
Mm,
his presidency, and they were saying like they just saw the cruelty of like the Iraq war and how it was a constant bombardment like from all sides, so you could not focus on one tragedy that was happening because
mhm,
there was 40, like you can't just focus on one historical event that was unprecedented because 50 just happened and you're disorientated. So to that point, and to your point also, I think we have to have a similar tactic, and that it has to be sort of like onslaught of different methods where like we're spreading the state thin instead of it being so pinpointed and organized because they can see us from a mile away,
Yeah.
and that's also why we have to change. I'm making a video currently about the parallels between the fall of South Africa, the fall of Jim Crow in America as it currently stands, and, did I say South Africa?
Yeah.
No, Rhodesia. So I'm making the parallels between those 3, and comparing them and analysis with Israel. And for me, even though Israel's tactics are continuingly to increase, I see weakness in Israel as a state right now. It very much reminds me of towards the end of World War II, where Hitler was just going around bombing everybody because he was afraid. And that's like kind of what this reminds me of. So because of that, I started pulling from history, like, oh, like what happens when apartheid states actually fall? Like, what are things that we can point to? And like to your point, what is the red canary? So for Jim Crow, it was the Sunday Bloody Sunday, march across the bridge in
Yeah,
Mississippi.
yeah,
People seeing that violence against students changed Jim Crow. Similar in South Africa, there was a bloody massacre against students that changed the political shift of people's understanding of what apartheid was at the
yeah,
time. So in both of those instances, including in Rhodesia too, with like the Bush Wars, like people started seeing how violent the wars were becoming and the imbalances between the two. The Rhodesian army having all these weapons and the native Zimbabweans not. So that changed the shift. So unfortunately, I think violence is what is going to make people change their tactics. But I think we're also seeing it now. Like people are coming to a level of class consciousness in a way where they're seeing that like the things that we experience is also violence. It's not just like, "Oh, this is the way things are." People are actively choosing to hurt and harm us as a collective. So the more people wake up to that fact, I think the more things will change, but unfortunately, things have to get a little bit worse before they get better, and
yeah,
more people have to see how bad things are.
yeah. And I think what you're saying, I one of the notes that I had was like looking at BLM from like its kind of conception to 2020, because I also think we're, if I'm thinking of like black, like I don't know, police brutality and abolition, I still think we're in the aftermath of 2020 because I think it was such a flashpoint. But if I'm thinking of like
Yes.
what changed in the movement and national legislation, getting some of the reforms of the demands of the earlier parts of the BLM movement, whether it be like citizens review commissions or body cameras or whatever the fuck it is, the failures of those reforms, and then the continued exposure to the public to police violence and anti-black police violence, and how regardless of those reforms, those videos still came out. Like
Mhm.
people are still getting shot in their fucking kitchens, and cops are walking free, and people that want to be public vigilantes can like basically just walk free. And how
Mhm.
2020 I think almost existed partially because of the lockdown and how many people were kind of bored and inside, but also because of the exposure to all of those violences post reform, it
Yep.
made people feel like it was necessary, because I do think there is the distinction between mass public mobilization where like riots break out, and that can't always be controlled tactically by like one or a number or group of people. It can happen spontaneously. But I do think if we're thinking of movements where people are trying to like hold control and like to seek control, it's like interesting to your point, because I did write down like civil rights MLK and how they were trying to use nonviolence to fight for legislative change. And to your point with
Mhm.
like Bloody Sunday, or I even think about like the Birmingham Children's Crusade, it was
Mhm.
those tactics from the nonviolent perspective that showed the viciousness of
Exactly.
segregation and white supremacy, and how it's interesting. It's like it's either like we have to be exposed to another level of political violence to see that a deeper and more militant reaction is necessary, or we have to choose tactics that expose the underlying truths of the system as well. We probably need to change our tactics or escalate when we can see that the state has co-opted or assimilated the demands of
Mhm.
our movement or the language of our movement.
Same way that the nonviolent acts of the civil rights movement exposed the inherent violence that Black people are experiencing, I think the uncommitted voters expose the inherent violence of the Democratic Party. Because look at how, like, insane some of these people responded to the entitlement that they had for the Muslim vote. Like, I knew it was bad for Muslim and Arab voters, but I didn't know it was that bad. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like like Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment is like on levels that like I don't remember seeing since Bush,
Mhm.
literally. Like, so yeah. I think, yeah, we expose them. That's how we see that we need to change our tactics. And paying attention to, like you said, knowing our enemies is very important. Knowing what they are doing, what they think we're doing, all of those things are important, but not to the point of, like, rationalizing them like
Yeah,
liberals do, but
yeah.
just to know, like on a boxing level, like you
Mhm.
my opponent likes the left hook, so Imma do a right jab.
Yeah,
That's all we're doing here.
yeah, yeah.
Another one I really liked was, I mean, it's a part of what we're already trying to do, Prince. Number 10 from Marios Papanopoulos. I hope I said your beautiful Greek name right. How to unify leftists that are not a part of the same agenda. Disagreeing on issues like central planning or market economy, social democracy versus democratic socialism, etc. How can all these people act together without infighting? We spoke a little bit about this before, but my initial thought, why is the lack of infighting our goal? Like, I know we don't wanna fight with each other, but, like, we are ideologically different. So, like, yes, there's gonna be we're not gonna agree with each other. Like I was just saying before, like, I think as long as people aren't being harmful,
Yeah,
then it's okay for us to disagree. Even people we look up to disagreed with each other. Like, Asada, for instance, she left the Black Panthers because she didn't think that they were radical enough for her, which is
yeah,
valid, but she
yeah,
left,
yeah,
but they still were fighting towards the same thing, which was the
yeah.
liberation of all Black people.
And I also think it's in the attempt to unify, like every attempt of unification isn't going to have the same results. And so contextual, I think it's also what is your agenda? Because how do you unify leftists that are not on the same agenda? If she left the party because it wasn't radical enough, then it doesn't mean that the attempt to be a part of that party was for nothing. It means that a political clarification was found, and that clarification ideally lets you know what direction you go in next. And I mean, it's like we could probably look at our lives and kind of look at like you're organizing with people, you think you have the same agenda, and at a certain point you realize like, oh, our agenda isn't the same. And I think there are a variety of things that can bring that to the surface. But yeah, to your point, it's like, is it infighting if we have to confront our differences, and that confrontation means I'm not going to work with you anymore, or I'm going to work with you differently? Because one of the things that I kind of wrote down as like a initial thought response is that I also think it's important for each faction or area of the left to ask themselves like, what work am I willing to do with my people, and what work am I willing to do with other people? Because I don't think that work is categorically the same for everyone. I think doing the work of canvassing is different than doing the work of a lockdown, or
Mhm.
anti-gentrification work, or going to city council. Like all of those are kind of different modes of organizing. And so maybe in a sense, like what might clarify this question is depending on the mode of organizing, I think that's when you look at like, is your agenda the same in that particular mode? Because if it isn't, maybe you don't have unity or shared principles, and that becomes like a space where you don't do work with each other, but the shared principles are like, we don't snitch on each other to the state. We don't allow fucking Nazis in our ranks. And so I think it's in a sense, it almost feels like a case by case, because I'm like, what agenda and what course of
Mhm.
action?
And I like your initial thought about, like, I think each faction or like each group should be solid on their own and like know what their values are so they can come and collaborate with others. And I think like we were talking about it a little bit, it comes with the idea of like understanding more theory than praxis. Where
Mhm.
like you have these ideas of like how things are going to go because of history. Like obviously anarchists and communists have a pretty tumultuous history when it comes to betraying each other, etc. Especially when it comes to anarchists being betrayed by communists in like Spain and things like that. But people bring it up when we're talking about like resisting against Nazis and things like that. Like, but if a communist and I have a equal common enemy, I see no problem with organizing with them.
Yeah.
Like, but will that mean that they'll come to my black bloc meeting where we're going to like do something else more serious where I need to know and trust everybody Probably not, but
Yeah.
can they come to the event where we're trying to make the alt-right leave this neighborhood? Yeah, like,
Yeah.
yeah, to your point, I think it really depends on what it is and what y'all are doing, and just having wherewithal in relation to that, like, there are people that will be considered, like, our acquaintances in this, and that's, like, all there will be. It's just, like, somebody like a comrade in the struggle, like, not a deeper relationship that, like, you can trust them, you know? It might just be like, "Oh, that's somebody I see at actions, and they have my back," and, like, that's where it could stay, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also just even interesting in, like, the purely social sense, like, there are people in my life that have stayed relatively politically the same or, like, their agenda has been the same the whole time I've known them, and there have been people that their agenda or the tactics or the ways that they express themselves have gotten more serious and more committed and militant, and so I think it's also trying to figure out how to exist in a space where you hold certain boundaries around interacting with the state or people that are fucking harmful in their ideologies versus, like, knowing when to disagree, when you don't wanna do certain kinds of work with people, and then also knowing, like, when certain work is possible, and I think all of that is complicated in case by case community work, and so, yeah, I think it's just yeah, there's no one answer.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know.
I think ultimately people can't avoid the hard work of
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Like, these are all very deep and thoughtful questions, but some of them really it's just like you have to do it and be willing to get messy, like Miss Frizzle said, like, make mistakes, get messy, like, that's literally the only way, and like you said before, Prince, like, that's the only time you'll really figure out if you are ideologically, like, aligned with someone or not, is if you get to talk to them.
yeah,
You're around them all the time, like, somebody could tell you that they like Karl Marx or whatever, but then you hear them say something that is against those values in passing, you can maybe confront them on it or challenge them on it, you know? Like, it's never gonna be like how it is in the internet where it's like a drive-by sort of.
yeah. Another question that I saw on the list that, I thought would be good to kind of answer, number 9, so, yeah, the one right above it, it's at Eli of the Forest, how to form mutual aid groups from friends and mutuals, how to establish goals to guide the group, and making sure people are safe when organizing. I feel like this is like a very big, comprehensive, but also like very useful question. And I feel like you've been doing a lot of mutual aid work recently.
Yeah, I think this is a good one, especially when it, talks about friends and mutuals, like, that's how I started organizing, honestly, and I've talked about it previously, and so have you all at the dugout, like, organizing does not have to be, like, a big thing. You forming a mutual aid group could literally be, like, you and your friends doing Sunday dinner,
Mhm.
and everybody pools their $10 that they have, and y'all all buy groceries together, and you cook together on Sunday, you have a community meal, and you share space with each other, like, that can start something massive. Like,
Yeah.
if you wanted to scale up that big, you can, but like that also is mutual aid. So think about it that way when you're talking about how to form groups from your friends and your mutuals. Think about what your needs are, like in your friend group.
Yeah.
Are y'all all queer? Do y'all need access to like reproductive health stuff, like condoms and Plan B and stuff like that? Okay, well, everybody pull their shit together and then somebody, hold it somewhere, so then y'all know, "Okay, I can go to so and so's house, I know plan B is there, I can pick up my plan B." Just stuff like that, like, it doesn't have to be a big, elaborate thing. When you're starting out with your friends, it could be just meeting you and your friends where you're at and, like, meeting the needs of your community there and building from there. Um, and to the second part of the question is, like, how to establish goals. That I think is better to do once things start to get in like a rhythm of stuff. Like
Yeah.
if y'all have been doing maybe your Sunday dinners for a couple months and now it's getting bigger, now I would say, okay, like get a signal group or a group chat together so y'all could actually start doing more elaborate things or planning more in depth. And then to answer the last part of your question, to make sure people are safe when organizing, if you're out doing actions, don't go by yourself. If you go by yourself, make friends with somebody. There will be a friendly face there that you will be able to trust. but I would highly advise you going with someone off rip. That's very important because um, you may need to turn off your cell phone, you may be in contact with the cops or something like that. It's just better to have somebody who has your back in relation to that stuff like that. And look into encrypted forms of communication, email, text. If you guys are going to be doing more serious, more disruptive actions, it's better to get offline.
The intention of the mutual aid is like a big thing to kind of figure out in the beginning because I do think like if it's something that's totally legal, but maybe it's in a context of like it's alongside other kind of movement work. Like I'm thinking of like food not bombs or legal fundraising or the potential for RICO charges, racketeering charges, like not to like go to the worst possible case scenario, but I'm thinking in terms of the safety question, like if you're organizing resources for people that are going through shit and are targeted, like I think those are considerations you should have. How you gain resources, how you share them with people, is it trackable?
Mhm.
Um, and so one, I think about that, but I think it's and then the establishing goals, call a meeting, you hold space with people together, you figure out what an agenda is, you figure out what you need to work through in the time and space that you have, and you try to be efficient or clear or whatever it is about what you're materially trying to do. And I think it's also important to have goals that are like quantifiable. Like, you might want to start off with like, we want to practice serving meals to folks in our community, like we're passing out food twice a week or twice a month, and then kind of scaling up from there. But I think to your safety question, like if you're doing the more precarious modes of mutual aid or organizing, or you're raising for like legal funds, or it's like large amounts of money or resources, look up the legal and like political ramifications of that. Like maybe consult with a lawyer, like figure out the ways that you can build in those processes, like you said.
I always like to explain to people that like we've been doing mutual aid, we just didn't know what it was called. You
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
when you help your friend pick them up from the hospital when they have surgery, that's that's mutual aid and community care. Like
Yeah.
that's being a friend, but that also is mutual aid and community
Yeah.
care. Like we're doing that already. So I think demystifying it will help people too, where they realize like, oh, I can do a potluck with my friends. Like it's really that simple. And then
Yeah.
add books. Now it's a potluck and y'all read books about theory there.
Yeah.
See, now you have a book club. So yeah, just have fun with it and build up because ultimately it's about community and helping and supporting each other. So it doesn't have to be like super duper serious unless y'all are doing like super serious work. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Gonna
if y'all
do
just
like
have fun.
yeah. Yeah. And I think it's like there's mutual aid is such a big topic and that's why I'm like, depends on the kind, because like some of them
Right.
I'm like, are you expropriating or is it reparations or is it
Right.
you're
What are we
raising
doing
money to
here?
sell lemonade? Like, it depends.
From McKay, how do we make direct action accessible? How do we include people with disabilities in accessibility issues? So my first thought is if it's inaccessible for one person, it's like it's not accessible to anyone. So for things like that, we have to just be more mindful. So for instance, if there is a meeting that you all have and you feel comfortable with putting it online. Make sure there's captions or a recording so people can like watch it later and read and go along at their own pace. If you have the ability to have someone who understands sign language to help sign, you should have them be there, part of it. If it's an in-person action, make sure there is accessibility when it comes to wheelchairs. And my biggest thing is, like, I know this is like a huge point of contention on the left currently, but, like, if we are organizing together, I think we should be wearing masks, like, straight up. Like, if we're in a space together, like, just put a mask on, it's fine. Like, you're in what is it, an hour? We're just gonna be talking about doing the free fridge or whatever, like, just put a mask on. Because if we're talking about accessibility and, you know, making things easy for people to feel safe. That's what we're gonna do. I remember during the beginning of all the marches that really happened in this past year because of Palestine, I kept seeing on the internet this sentiment of like a growing community of people with like long COVID who are like upset that they couldn't go to some of the protests and the actions like they want to because they have long COVID. They like don't want to risk getting COVID again. Um, and just stuff like that, where it's like, I know it's like a level of like discomfort for people, but like for me, it's like if you are unwilling to make a sacrifice in like a small way and that way, like how can I trust you in organizing in big things?
Yeah.
Like you say you want to shut down the government, and you can't put a N95 on for like 10 minutes for me when you go into the grocery store, like how can I trust you to be my actual comrade? So that's like how I feel about it. Like even if you don't do it in your day-to-day life like 100%, like I'm all about harm reduction in the same way how it was with like during like the HIV AIDS crisis where it's like at first people were just afraid, like queer people were afraid to touch each other period in the beginning, but then they started figuring out ways how we could still be in community with each other, still share intimacy and sexuality with each other while keeping each other safe. And that's where I'm at right now. So it's like we could still go to shows, we could still do all those things, but we have to do things that are helpful for others. So if that means making things more accessible for everybody, wheelchair users, people who have hearing issues, just any level of accessibility challenges, we need to amplify those. And because if somebody has that and we make it easier for them, then it makes it easy for everybody.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah, and I will say to this question, like I think one thing that's helped me over time is like even for myself knowing that I don't always take everything into consideration, but I think one, it's important not to view being accessible just in general as like an inconvenience if you maybe don't have
Yes.
those particular accessibility kind of concerns or needs. And then I think on top of that, it's just like continuing to learn and building things into your process. Like I think since COVID-19, like people being more aware of like being immunocompromised or pre-existing conditions. I think that's something that's being built into our organizing framework more. And there's going to be things in the future that I think me or other people are going to continue to learn. And I think it's just be humble, hold space, and
Mhm.
I think like yeah, literally don't view it as an inconvenience because it is how we build a better world moving forward. I think is kind of how I look at it.
It's yeah, it's important to make sure everybody feels safe and supported, because it also helps bring different perspectives. Like there's so much that we can learn from our comrades just because of different experiences that they have that we don't have. So we should be willing to understand that point and really lead with empathy. I think that's like the most important things, especially with most of these questions. I think overall, this is like my summary, I guess, since I know we're winding down now. I feel like in general, that's like what the left really needs. It's like we need to just stay focused and grounded in our empathy. Um and how we organize moving forward, how we protect ourselves, how we protect each other, how we keep negative people out of our ranks. Like it all is gonna have to come from a place of like leading with our heart
Yeah.
and our mind, not just our mind and being like woke scoldy about stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I definitely feel that after this year in particular, like there's been a lot of situations where I've left certain organizing scenarios and I've been like, was I too helpful or did I offer too much or did I like ignore certain red flags? And I do think there are useful lessons we can take away in terms of like how do we stay unified or how do you know when someone's like not as much of an ally and they're an enemy. But I also think what I've kind of learned to your point is to your kind of first point, we can have such an expectation around what being a revolutionary radical is. Do I even know what I'm doing? Offer other people empathy and also offer yourself empathy because I do think there are mistakes that are going to be made along the way when we're trying to build trust and solidarity with each other. And those mistakes don't mean that people aren't worth shit. It's just a matter of
Right.
when those mistakes lead to material harm or they
Right.
denigrate someone's like position or place as a human being and in a space with other people, and how I think we need to understand kind of the difference between, yeah, like offering people grace and offering or holding space for like harmful or fucked up ideology. And I do think there's a very clear difference,
Mhm.
and sometimes it can become
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. And yeah, one last thing is it's so true. Like that's something that I have to I really had to reconcile with them myself too about what you're saying about like is this future going to have people in it that I disagree with, and like on a fundamental level I want everybody to be okay. Like, even people I disagree with, like, we have nothing in common. I still don't want any harm to happen to them.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, I have to make sure my principles are constantly realigning to that. That's like my compass, like that's how I guide myself. So as long as people aren't being harmful in that way, I can organize with them. We can hold space and create things together, I think.
Go check out Lucretia's channel because it's amazing, and there's only going to be more amazing things coming.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we're collabing. Thanks so much.
Hal. We're here with a comrade, co host of the Dugout podcast. If you haven't listened to it, you should. What kind of political moment do you feel like we're in? And what kind of organizing do you feel like might be necessary in the years to come? I guess it's like a first question. It's a very bird's eye question, but I'm thinking of it in terms of a lot of folks might be watching this and they don't really know where to start and they might be confused about their own way of contextualizing. So I'm wondering how you'd answer that question.
I recently heard a report back from an old head around the 99 World Trade Organization protests and how much spectacle and the role of imagery and lockboxes and feeling like it was a war zone, but at the same time, then trying to have an internationalist worldview, then realizing you're not in the war zone. You're in Columbus, Cleveland, New York City, not in Cobain or Raqqa, which were having revolutions in Damascus at the same time. How there's an escalation in political violence. I do hope that that draws people into building kinds of community that makes them feel safe and open instead of falling into despair and isolation. Because you can be lonely in a group of people, but can you recognize that yourself and do something about that to change the situation and surroundings as much as one does have power, and realizing then one's powerlessness and how to obtain that, not only for yourself, but for other people. I think that can fit into a lot of different movement spaces.
Next question is, what was your initial point of radicalization, and what was the distance between your initial radicalization and when you began to do community organizing? And what kind of community organizing was that?
The first time I really considered myself organizing or like recognizing that as like an act, that it was around like environmentalism. And it was just kind of like the plain facts of everything in front of me, becoming an adult, and then realizing that things had to be done and moving through different processes, engaging with the state, community leaders, my neighbors, but all kind of in the end goal of just like recognizing this like existential threat that we have. And it was a lot of like youth based stuff as well. Then I'd say what really radicalized me during that process was engaging, honestly, like state actors, like as like state representatives, and being and seeing the political web and being a part of it for the first time, at least
Seeing it up close.
yeah, yeah, like being in office room meetings with the aides and folks for state reps to talk policy and get transit stuff and more ecological conservation cores. And it's like, even if that stuff goes through, it's like building the American project and hiding over the history of colonialism, or finding different ways to wrap up the colonial endeavors that we have, and realizing, oh, maybe there are different or more expansive questions to be asking and moving around at the same time. And that just took more learning, being like, okay, who's doing work?
And this kind of leads into another question that me and Lucretia talked about a lot, because we basically worked off of a question and answer list that folks asked us online. But one question that kind of came up a few different times, and I feel like you and I have talked about this a lot in different forms, is how do you organize with people that agree on principle but disagree on method or tactics?
I find it's like, how close do you have to actually work with them? If you have some of the same goals and principles, that's more than you're gonna share in common with a lot of people. Um, it's also like, is this your neighbor? Is this your family member? How much do you have to interact with this person? Is this a coworker? Like, is this labor organizing, or is this um people who hate the same company and want it to stop doing something, and two different methods and tactics and strategies around an aligned goal with certain principles of even just halting the procession of the capitalist death machine in any way, shape, or form. Like, that can be acknowledged, but I think that you don't have to work with everyone. But that being said, you still have to create the point of distinction, recognize, like, of, if you're gonna have your tactic, do your tactic organize around that, get folks, propose it, modify it.
It's because I almost feel like the question almost assumes that people can't organize with each other if they disagree on methods or tactics. And it seems like some of what you're saying is like build a shared space where people can do different tactics and you aren't trying to like punish each other. One thing that me and Lucretia talked about a lot is like what, because, or at least what I was thinking is like, what kind of work? Because I'm like, if I'm petitioning with you and yeah, like that's the method we agree upon at that time. It's like the campaign can change, circumstances can change. And I also think like in this question I'm almost like, is the other assumed question is like, if someone disagrees with your method, they're going to like sell you out, or because I feel like there's almost like follow-up
Yeah.
questions, and as long as you're not selling each other out, I mean theoretically that's a fucking movement. But I think maybe some of what this question is kind of asking is, how do you deal with people when they try to block a certain methodology or tactic where they're coming from? But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting base question, because I'm like, I feel like there's like 5 other questions in there. Are you a supporter of more nonviolent protest or direct action, or violent direct action? Or where do you fall on that line philosophically, or how have you worked through that in your life?
Well, I mean, so the thing that comes to my head when I hear this question is like, they're so much a part of the same circles. If you house a weapons cache, or a fugitive on the run who's a political dissident, are you a part of the violent movement, even though you didn't do anything, or are you a part of the nonviolent movement? I mean, because I think also about like the people who tend to do militant actions historically are also doing care work, legal work, like reproductive labor. And then how much of that is ignored and sidelined in both the binary and the question of violence and nonviolence? Because at the center of it, yeah, it's that, what do we need to sustain something that can grow, yeah, you gotta fight back.
Gendered nature of revolutionary work, or like our images of revolutionary work, and it's like the violence is always something you do when theoretically you have nothing to lose, or when the stakes are so high. But then there are also different factors as to why the stakes are so high. Like when we were watching Judas and the Black Messiah, and that was like an episode on the Dugout, like one thing that I thought was nice was that Fred Hampton's partner, Erica, what was her name? Fred Hampton's partner in the movie, what's her name? Deborah. But when we were watching Judas and the Black Messiah, um, or like when you watch a lot of revolutionary film or depictions of revolutionary processes, there's always the point where it's like if it's a couple, the woman gets pregnant and then the guy's like, we need to fight the revolution, and then she's like, what the fuck are we gonna do about our kid? And I guess I think about like what you're speaking to is like the conflict between what do we need, what is necessary to do now versus what is necessary to do in terms of like this personal or interpersonal or collective trajectory, and like how do you weigh the differences. And then I also think like with the nonviolence violence question, I think it depends on the context and what either methodology is trying to expose. Like once again, if I think about MLK, like a lot of people disagreed with this shit, but it did expose a certain kind of contradiction, which I think made it somewhat effective. In other ways, on a personal individual level, it made it less effective for certain people. And then like going to a protest, there's a bunch of anarchists, they're like, fuck yeah, like, woo, we gotta do this shit. And then they leave all the people that have different levels of ability behind, and those people get arrested and charged by the state, and the able-bodied anarchists got to have their little fucking wet dream. Is violence worth it then?
It's kind of like in superhero movies when they leave all the damage and collateral damage behind, and how that's been kind of a theme, especially in Marvel, which is also interesting because they managed to have a civil war about such government intervention and being the clave and save to humanity, while also platforming eco-genocidal fucking beliefs and anti-anarchist sentiments with the Border Smashers and Thanos. That just made me think of that. Communication is very important for any thing in your life, whether with family, friends, comrades, institutions, anything. Always want to be clear, concise, and safe. And whatever that means is up to you and your risk plan and your risk assessment and the safety plans that you make with those that are valuable in your life. And one thing to consider is using communication methods that you've put some thought into, whether it's for the time being, Signal's a pretty fan favorite. Proton can be a pretty fan favorite. There are some things that you should look into and different considerations around communication safety, but it's always an intention that's great for all levels of security and all levels of communication. It's great to have a good security culture, because good security culture is only as strong as its weakest link, which means the best way to infiltrate a good or bad community culture is by just points of communication, and that's where everybody's weakest link is, because that's how data works. Do your own research. Always do your own research, or know someone who knows how to do their own research around specific topics. You don't have to be an expert in everything, but you can know people who are good in a lot of things, and that in and of itself is a skill.
Thank you for being on this segment of Direct Action 101.
Thank you for watching this Direct Action 101 Q&A series. Let me know in the comments what you resonated with in this video, in the Lucretia portion or the Jordan portion. And let me know some comments you have about direct action, and also drop some comments to let me know more questions you might have. If you've been liking any of the political videos and breakdowns that you've seen on this channel, another place that you can go to learn more about politics, especially far leftism, anarchism, blackness and anarchism, is the Dugout podcast. Yes, I run a podcast called The Dugout. It's available on any platform that you can listen to podcasts, and there's also a YouTube channel for it. And I talk about a lot of things that are adjacent or similar to this channel. We've done episodes talking about different aspects of the Black Panther Party. We've done radical media reviews. And this year, we're doing a lot more interviews with folks that are also going to be featured on this Direct Action 101 series, including the likes of Jamal Joseph, who was a part of the Black Panther 21, or Janina Abram-Irvin, who was one of the last editors of the Black Panther newspaper, and so much more. The podcast is definitely a labor of love, and I like that it's also an alternative space for folks that like engaging on this channel to go somewhere else and learn more and binge and dive in, because there's definitely a lot to dig into. So check out the Dugout anywhere where you can listen to podcasts.